Okay, we got 3 more classes for the course. So we got today, we got next Monday, we got next Wednesday. Next Wednesday, make sure you come. Well, I know all of you have regular attendance to this class, but if you see your friend who doesn't really come often, ask them to come next Wednesday because we'll talk about tips for the exam next Wednesday. All right? Just tell your friend for their best interests. And for today and Monday, I would like to talk about a final topic for the course. It's called how you can use Java API. I'll get to the topic in just a moment. Let me just give you a little bit more context why we are covering this last lecture. So basically, up to now in the course, let me just see this. Okay, make sure I started recording. Yes, okay. So up to now, we have talked about much about the basics of Java programming. We talk about elementary programming, we'll talk about if statements, we talk about loops, and we talk about OOP. Specifically, the programming pattern we require you to implement during the lab test using array in order to store objects in your objects, right? So for you as a beginner, so this will be a very important exercise to do everything from scratch. But now let's say beyond this course, if you want to become a part-time Java programmer in the summer, or later on if you want to study further about programming, so this lecture will be very important to make a connection, okay? Basically, what's the spirits for this lecture here? If you are developing your Java application or if you program in any other language, the principle is you do not want to reinvent the wheel if people have done stuff for you. Basically, every time before you try to solve a problem, always Google first. Google to see if people have solved this problem already. If they have, they might have already made their source code or API. I'll talk about API in just one moment. They may have made their solution available publicly, in which case you can just reuse and you don't have to actually implement everything from scratch by yourself. But it's 2 different concerns, okay? Anyway, up to now, everything we have done, we have been building things from scratch just to strengthen your basics. But now for this lecture here, we're going to show you there are many things that have been done by professional Java developers, and they have been published online for you to use. I'll just give you a flavor about using 3 different classes, okay? Just to, for you to go further. Okay, so API here is a very important word. We'll talk about it. The learning outcomes for this lecture, we really want you to become independent, so you can explore the Java API. I'll talk about API in just one more in the next slides. And then we'll talk about how you can read the methods from people who actually make them available. Okay, it's called header. We did talk about method header previously. It includes the return type, the name of the method, the parameter type, right? Just without the implementation. And also we talk about the difference between parameters and arguments. I'll mention that again quickly today. Okay, that's also important for you to know. And also we talk about static versus non-static. So as we go through this lecture, we'll actually show you how you can call different kinds of methods. The method that's available to you might either be static or non-static. We'll see how we can use them. Okay, okay, and also we'll see static versus non-static. Okay, so now let's just demystify the acronym. I'll read it to you. The title here simply say API. API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's basically just some interface for you to use some service that's provided by other developers. Okay, so now also it's a little bit cut off. Each time before you start solving a problem, as a beginner, we say you have to implement everything from scratch. But now for this particular lecture, once you get more experience, I think you experienced enough up to this point. What you really want to do is you want to, before you implement anything, check to see if it is already solved in the library that's provided by Java. Okay? If you actually program in Python or C#, for example, they also got their own libraries. Okay? So Java is just one example. Okay? So the rule of the thumb, do not reinvent the wheel. Okay? That's an old saying, but it does apply over here, right? Once you get more experience to do your own project for commercial purposes or for other purposes, always check to see if people have done that already so you can reuse them. Okay, so API stands for Application Programming Interface. Okay, that's an acronym you should know. And now, what's really that? API is just a collection of methods and classes, so you can feel free to use them without knowing how exactly they are implemented. Okay, that's the idea. But we'll talk about 3 examples in this particular lecture today and next Monday. We'll talk about the math library, We talk about array list. We also talk about hash table. So these are the most common 3 libraries for you to use. For those of you who go to 2030 in the fall, you will also need to use those libraries. So it will be a nice preview for you. Okay. So now, let me just point to you some reference over here quickly. So there is a website over there for Java. If you simply click on that, it's actually under Oracle. If you just click on that, Java 8 at the moment. Okay, you will see this website over here. Let's see. Okay, it's a very simple website over here. Basically, this is just the home page telling you it's for Java version 8 over here. And then on the left-hand side, you got all kinds of classes over here. You can see you got hundreds of classes over here. All the classes over there are already available on your laptop when you install your Java 1.8 in the beginning. Okay, you just haven't used them so far. Okay, we'll only look at 3 of them in this particular lecture. Okay, and I'll show you how you can do your self-exploration. Okay, so there's a website. You can feel free to look at that. In the exam, we will only want you to know about math, array list, and hash table. Only these 3 classes. And you don't need to memorize the API for these 3 classes. Any question I ask you about these 3 classes, I'll give you the API. But in the lecture, I'll show you how you can read them. Okay, so you'll be independent during the exam. Okay, no memorization is necessary. Okay, so now if you want to use a library class, now here's the important thing. Remember in lab test 3, I said it's strictly forbidden for you to use any import. But now we are moving to a different context, assuming that you're more experienced. Now, if you want to use the service from somebody else, you want to use import. Okay, just to say that. One example, let's say you want to use ArrayList. What you had to say is import and then Java that you tell the ArrayList. You don't need to memorize this line. This line can also be generated by Eclipse. I'll show you in just a moment. Okay, and then once you import it, you can now declare, let's say I have a variable over here called myList, the variable name. To the left-hand side is the type of the list. I can just say ArrayList. It's not complete just yet. I'll give you more context. I'll do some Eclipse programming together with you as well. So for next week, we got Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for the lab sessions. I'm going to make them optional in the sense that I will distribute some additional exercise for you on the collection library that we're going to talk about in the lecture. I would say it's mainly for you to help you prepare for the exam. So once you master those exercises, Tia will be there to help you, and then you should be ready for the exam, just for that part. Okay? I will give you more information tomorrow or over the weekend. Okay, so now let's talk something very quickly about the concept. Okay? We'll talk about classes versus methods. So what is a method? So now, so far we have been doing all the methods by ourselves. What's really a method? A method is simply a block of code with a name that you can simply just reuse the method body, the implementation, by calling its name, right? By passing your inputs. That's really something we have done over and over. So now, once we go to the math class, for example, you can see there is a square root, SQRT, square root method. I think we used that in one of the videos when we calculate the distance. Basically, if you go to the math class, you will see there's a method header for square root. Okay, I'll show you how it looks like. I'll give you another example. How about this? If you look at the API, let me just go there directly. Okay, so you want to see some example right away, and I'll come back here. Okay, I'll come back to here in maybe just one moment. It's better to show you one example right away. So now, if you go to the slides about the math class, so there's a link. Okay, if you click on that, let's see that. So there is a page for the class called math. Okay, for every class that you may want to use, you will see some description about the math class itself. Okay, basically every function, trigonometry function, or any absolute value, square root, or pi, or any numerical function you learn from your mathematical textbook is available in the math class. So that means you don't have to implement, for example, square root or absolute value yourself. You can just use them. Okay. And then you can when you try to explore the API, you can just scroll, explore the web page yourself. What I want to show you is, for the there is a particular section called method summary. Okay, this is a section I might just give to you in the exam. Okay, so basically method summary over here is just going to give you a sequence of methods which you can use from this particular class. And you can use them without knowing exactly how you can implement them. It's like driving. You can drive a car without knowing exactly how to engineer a car. Okay? Similar analogy. Okay? Let's just have a look at just one example. And I do want to talk about one concept over here quickly. For example, if you look at that, let me just draw your attention. You can see there is basically section by section. Each section tells you the information about a particular method you can call. Okay? Let's switch to iPad over here. Okay? So this is just some of them. Okay? So now let's see this. Basically, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have 4 different methods over here. Okay? Just as a snapshot over here. Every time when you see the API for a particular class, when you see the method summary, the first part to look at is how many methods available there for you to use. Okay? In this case, we have ABS. It simply gives you some description to say return the absolute value of a double value, and then return the absolute value of a float value. Okay? So they seem to be a separate methods. So now one thing I want to draw your attention. Okay? You can see that the name of these methods are exactly the same. Okay? So these are just the same. Identical method name. Okay, the name is simply identical. But now, if you recall from one of the tutorial videos, we want to be careful, for example, when we define a constructor. You want to make sure the number of parameters for your constructor between versions of constructor must be different. If they are the same, you want to make sure that types is able to let you distinguish between the versions, right? That's what we said in one of the tutorial videos. Now, in this case, can we actually tell? The answer is yes. If you look at the parameter type, over here, for the first version of it, you can think about version number 1, version number 2, version number 3, and version number 4. Version number 1, we have only one single parameter of type double, which means if you want to use this particular method, you have to give a double value to call that. Okay? And over here, you have also another one which is float. Okay? You have another one which will take an int. You have another one which will take a long. So they are simply different types. So there's no ambiguity over here. Okay? So now there's a special terminology you want to know about, which exists in many programming languages, for example, Java and C#. Okay? Let me write it down for you. It's called overloading. Okay, what does overloading really mean? It's a simple idea. Overloading simply means you have multiple methods which have exactly the same name. However, their parameter types are different. Okay, that's exactly what we are seeing over here. Okay, so overloading, which means multiple methods. Okay, make sure I don't go over the board. Multiple methods have the same name, but different parameters, but distinct parameter types. Okay, that's what overloading means. When you refer to the slides, you will see something similar. So now make sure you understand what overloading is. Simply means with the same name but different parameters. Okay? So now you can see the absolute method, ABS, is overloaded. Okay? You can see the same name but different types. Okay, that's about the name and the parameters. Let's look at the left-hand side. Now, let's look at something you're very familiar. You can see we have double, float, int, and long. So these denote the return type. Okay? So that means if you try to call that particular methods, these are the value type that will be returned back to you. Okay? So these are the return type. Okay? So one thing to note, because every version over here for ABS, they return something. So that means they should be accessor as opposed to mutator, right? Okay, let's write it down. So that means the ABS is an accessor. You will see some example later when we talk about array list and hash table. We also have mutator methods, in which case you will see the return type being void. Okay? Now, let's come to something you're not so familiar with. Okay? It's something rather tricky. They also got another modifier over here, static. Okay, static. Now, let's try to recall exactly what static really means. Static simply means it's a variable or a method that belongs to the class rather than belonging to individual instance of the class. So what the consequence of that is, if you want to call any of the method that's static, you do not have to create a context object. You can simply use the class name. Okay? For example, okay, as soon as you see something that is static, so that means you can call the method using the class name. In this case, the class name is simply just math. Okay? One example right away. I can say math, which is a class name, dot, and then absolute value. For example, I can say minus 2.8. In that case, it's going to return back to me 2.8, for example, right? You can see the input parameter type, input argument here is double. The return value is also a double. Because it is static, I can use a class name to call that. Okay? Any question up to now? Okay. Math is a very special class, which is called utilities class. Okay. For those of you who go to 2030 later, you will see this term again, but if you don't, no worries. Math is so-called utilities class. Utilities class in the sense that you do not have to create objects in order to actually call the methods. You can just use a class name to call the methods. Okay, that's simply what it means. We'll give you more detail if you take 2030 later, but if not, you don't have to worry. Okay, so now let's go back here. That's about the math class. Okay, so that's something we just go over in detail. And you should really know about method overloading. Okay, which is about overloading. Okay, and then that's just another example to show you how you can call. Okay, before I go to the case study, I would like to finish some concept very quickly, and then we'll go for the some coding and case study. So this is a little bit like a repetition from before, but let's go quickly. Okay, so we talk about whenever you see any method name, for example, when I see absolute value over here, for example, this one here, I only see the description about the method itself. I don't see exactly how the absolute value method is implemented. I don't need to. Okay, that's really important. Okay, and then so now you have to distinguish between non-static versus static. In these cases, we simply got static methods. So that means we have to call that using the class name. However, later on, you will see if the static keyword is not there, that means you have to create that particular class, create an object from there in order to call the method. We'll see example. Okay, so you will just have to use a context object, right? So we keep talking about context objects. It's the number one important concept when you do OOP. Okay, for example, if I try to declare a list, and then I will say it's called Arraylist. Arraylist is a class we'll talk about in detail. And then I'm saying that every element in the Arraylist is a string. I'm just having pretty much like an array of string. And then I simply create that, and then initially just empty. You can see I'm using the new keyword. The exact syntax for using collection library, I will show that to you when we go to Eclipse. And then after that, we can simply call the add method. The add method here belongs to the Arraylist class, and then we simply have to use a context object, which is list over here. Okay? Okay, very good. And then also about static method. Okay, in that case, we can simply use math.square root 1.44. Okay, so for those of you who are a little bit confused from the previous video, when I try to calculate the distance between 2 points, I simply call the square root and also power methods without creating any objects. Now you see why. Because those methods, all the methods in the math class are simply static. So you do not have to create any math objects in order to call that. Okay? Okay, so now I'll get to this a little bit later. Okay, so now finally, what is a class? A class is simply a collection of methods, okay, as we have seen. And these are the information you'll be given in the API. Okay, and also we talk about parameters versus argument. I want to just make a final emphasis. Okay, you should really know about the difference between these two. I'll write it on the iPad. Okay, very simple distinction. When you talk about definition or definition, and also we talk about the usage. So these are two different contexts. Okay, So now let's take the math class as an example. Let's say we are now talking about the API of the math class. Over there, you see something like this. You see static, let's say double, ABS for absolute value, and then we'll say double over here, and also X. Okay? So now this is the so-called header of the method. Okay? So now this is so-called parameter. Okay? This is where you define that. So now how do I use it? Because the method itself is static. So I'm going to say math dot absolute value minus 2.4, for example. Okay? So over here, I'm basically saying, because it is expecting some double value, I'm just giving you a double value, just one example. So this is so-called arguments. Okay? So that's a very quick review on what's the difference between parameter and arguments. You can think about parameter is how you declare the method to be. Okay? Argument is simply one example to pass as the parameter. Okay? Any question about this? Okay? All right. Okay, after this, I'm going to talk, okay, also header. The header of the method is going to include the name, the parameters, and also the output or return type. In the case of mutator, it's just going to be void. Okay? Okay, it's good. So now let's talk about the math class. I'll just give you one example over here. Okay? Let's say you want to develop some console application, like in the previous lab. Let me give you some information over here. I don't really give you any source code over here because it's rather easy to implement. Let's say the problem is you want to implement a program that works in the following way. Somehow, your program randomly generates a number between 0 and 100. It could be 54, it can be 69, it can be any number. And then, but the user of your program does not know about this randomly generated number. And then you simply just ask the user to actually guess what the number is. Okay? So now, this is very easy to implement based on what we have done in the previous lab. But now, we want to know the critical part. How do you randomly generate a number? Okay? Random number generation is just one example where you don't want to implement from scratch by yourself. It's already supported in the math class. Okay? So now we're just trying to show you you can simply use the API. So now let me give you some hints over here. Okay? If you look at one of the methods in the math class, it's called random. Okay? Let's say this is all the information you're given. How can we judge how to use it, right? So now let's try to read it. So we have a method called random over here, and random does not have any parameters, which means when you use it, you don't need to pass any input. Just call math.random, just that. And now, what does random return? It returns simply just a double value. But what exactly is a double value, we'll see. And then it is static, which means you don't need a context object to call that. Okay? So now let's read a little bit more. If you look at the description over here, it tells you return a double value with a positive sign, a positive number, basically. Greater than or equal to 0.0 and less than 1.0. So what does that mean? If you look at that, let me just give you another page over here. Which means if I try to use this method here, I say math is a static one, so I can just say math.random. Okay? It is going to return a number that's between 0 and 1. Okay, let me just read it again. It's going to return a double number between 0 and 1. Okay? 0 and 1. To be a little bit more mathematical, it's basically going to be this particular interval, 0 and 1.0, exclusive on the right-hand side. Okay, for those of you who are taking calculus, so this notation should not be too strange to you, right? Okay, so that means what can be a possible number that's generated? It could be 0.2, right? It can be 0, it can be 0.79, it can also be, for example, let's say 0.99. For example, right? But it cannot be 1.0 because it's exclusive, so that's not possible. Okay, so these are the possible numbers. So now, Let's say we want to make use of this particular method that's already implemented and that's available to us. How can we use it? For example, if you look at the original problem description, what the program wants to generate will be between 0 and 100. But what random can generate will be between 0 and 1. Okay? There should be a very easy, straightforward mapping function you can define, right? Whatever that's being generated, for example, 0.2. Whatever that's being generated, why don't I just multiply 100 to there, and then I'll simply get 20. So that's a number that's randomly generated between 0 and 100, right? And also, if that happens to be 0.79, multiplied by 100, that should correspond to 79. So my program is just going to make a call to the random method in the method class, in the math class, and then multiply by 100. Okay? That's kind of the idea. So now, that's the only example I will expect you to get familiar with from this slide here. But now, I want to ask you some question over here. So there will be some critical bits in your program you want to be careful about. Let's consider two possibilities. So the first one, I'm going to write both possibilities on the slides as well. We're going to need some explanation. So now the first one, if you can read it through, math.random, and then multiply by 100. Okay, that's one version. Versus the second version over there, we also get, let me write it down, and then I will talk about it. Okay, you can see there's parenthesis over there for the second version. Random multiply by 100. Okay, so now we got two versions over here. You got a blue, you got a green. Okay, exactly the same as what's shown in the slides. So now, the question is, which version should be correct? None of them or both of them? Okay, let's try, let me give you a number here. Version number 1 and version number 2. So this is a very legitimate exam question, right? And I'll give you a little bit hints. In order to answer this question here, using the method itself is very easy because all you need to know is math.random is going to give you a number that's in between 0 and 1.0, first of all, right? You know that this part over here is going to give you some number between 0 and 1.0. Similarly, for this math.random, this part here is going to give you between 0 and 1.0. Okay, that's all you need to know about the API. Okay, but now, between version 1 and version 2, this requires some knowledge about elementary programming, specifically cast. Right? We talk about cast. Make sure you review that for the exam. Okay? Do you want to say something? Yeah. Any thoughts or? Aha, very good. Yes, that's exactly correct. Okay. So let me just repeat what you just said. Okay. Version number 1 will not work. Okay. It will compile, but it will not work for the following reason. Let's say, for example, if version number 1 actually generates, let's say, 0.79, let's say, what do we expect to see after the multiplication? 79. However, it's not going to be 79 because, let me just show you here. You can see that, let me be very step by step here. This part over here, let's say if that part returns 0.79. So now the question is, when you don't have the parenthesis, is the cast going to happen first or the multiplication going to happen first? That's the question. Okay? If you recall what we did in the elementary programming lecture, this part here has higher precedence than the multiplication, which means it's as if you're trying to do the cast first. It's as if. Okay? So now, what does it really mean when you try to cast 0.79 into an integer? You're truncating all the fractional part. In which case, you'll simply just get 0. That's all you get after the cast. So once you get 0, 0 multiplied by 100 is going to give you 0. That is why this version here is not good. Okay? It's not going to give you the result you're expecting. Because what we're expecting to see is to multiply that number there by 100 and then do the cast rather than the other way around. On the other hand, for version number 2, it is going to work because now we are using the parentheses to force the order of evaluation. So we're going to say whatever you generate, for example 0.79, multiply by 100 first, and then you'll get 79. Okay, 79, and then 79 cast into integer, you'll just get 79. Okay, another one more example in case you're confused. What if I got 0.23333? What if, right? It can be any double number between 0 and 1. In this case, it will still work because if you try to do this, let me say it again over here. If I say integer over here, okay, make sure you can see that, and then parentheses, I say math.random, and over here multiply by 100. Okay, let's have a look quickly. So now let's say we are generating this particular number from math.random, which is 0.23333. So now we're going to do the multiplication first. That's going to give us 23.333. And now when you do the cast, it's going to truncate the fractional part, which will give you 23 eventually. So that's going to work. It will always give you some integer that's between 0 and 100. Okay? So don't lose the big picture. This is just one example of using the API from a class, right? So now in the exam, for the math class, I would suggest you just go over whatever mathematical function they have over there to make sure you're familiar with them, especially the one I showed in the slide, random, and also absolute value, square root, and also the power, okay? That's what we use in the tutorial videos. Any questions? Another lesson to remember is when you're using the return value from the accessor, you want to make sure whatever you learned back in elementary programming still applies. Everything should really start to connect, from this point. Okay, that's about the math class. Let's now do a little bit more interesting 2 classes. I think I will only start with the Arraylist today. Possibly I cannot finish that, but I'll definitely continue from Monday. So now we're going to see a class I'll read it to you. It's called Arraylist. Arraylist, basically, this is how you can think about what an arraylist is. In your lab so far, in your lab test, where you are required to use the array, primitive array, you always have to give a fixed size to say maybe it will only store up to 200 orders, in which case the array size should be 200. We didn't actually show you how you can grow the size of the array. It's doable, but it's a bit too complicated for this course. So now, Arraylist actually solves this problem for you automatically. So you can think about Arraylist is basically like an array where you don't have to worry about resizing the array list. You don't have to. Whatever you want to add, just add in. Whatever you want to remove, just remove. Okay? So now, let's see this. When you see the slide, there's a link. Let's click on the link quickly, and I'll show you something here. So now, let's see. So if you go to the page for the array list, it will say it's a class and then array list. So this syntax over here, okay, look very strange. I would say you don't have to worry about this syntax for this course. Let me just give you a little bit information just in case you're interested. It is something called generics. Okay, only for those of you who want to explore this in the summer. Generics. It's a very advanced topics which we only cover in the later courses for the programming. You have to know about a topic called inheritance. For those of you who know about Java, you might have seen this already. For those of you who don't know, you don't need to worry. I will not test you about generics in the exam. But just for your information, it's called this term. Okay. Okay, so now if you go back to the class over here, generic simply means you have to give a type for every element in the array list. It's just like when you declare an array, you have to say what's the type for every element. It can be integer, can be person, can be points, etc. Okay? And then we also got some description for the class. You can see it's resizable. Okay? Rather than fixed sized. And if you go further, you also talk about how you can create an array list. So this is the constructor. We're going to use this one just for simplicity. It's simply going to be the constructor, it takes no input. Okay? And then we also got a method summary. You have many methods over here. Okay? I would say only focus on the ones I'm trying to show you in the example. That's all I expect from you for the exam. Okay? So now let's have a look. What I would do is, let me just go to the iPad quickly to give you some overview. And then we'll do some programming together. Okay? So these are the common methods for the array list. Okay? So now let's see what we can use. Basically, you can see that over here. Let me just do some coloring over here. Let's say I'm going to use blue for all the accessors. You can see size is an accessor, not void. Add is an accessor. Also contains is also an accessor. And also remove, accessor, remove, and also index of, and get. Most of the methods are accessor, except for one. Over here, you also got another method over here, add. That does not return anything. Okay? So that means both are possible. You can either get an accessor or a mutator. Okay? So now let me just give you a very quick overview. Basically, when you're trying to create an array list, you can inquire about how many elements are there in the list so far. It's pretty much like an NOC, right? The number of courses or number of points, as we talk about. And also, you can also try to add some elements into the list, okay? So now, over here, whenever you see E over here, it's something to do with generics. All you need to know is to say, whenever you see this E here, it simply means the element type. Okay? The way you declare the array list, I will give you one example here. You might say array list. Let's say every element in the array list is a string. I can say string over here. In which case, I can say this is list number 1. Okay, I'm just declaring. Let me give you another one. I can still use array list over here. Let's say every element in the array list is a person, for example. I can say person over here, and then I can say list 2. So these are two different variables, both of type array list. However, every element in array list number 1 is a string. And every element in array list 2 is a person. Okay? You can see that from the element type. So now this E over here simply refers to the element type, as we'll see. Okay? And then also you got contains, which tells you whether or not the input is actually inside the list that we have added so far. And also you can remove at a particular index. Okay, we'll see that. This is something we have not shown you how to do in the primitive array. It's a rather complicated action to implement, but you can do it easily in the array list. Okay, and also you can figure out the index of, so you should also be familiar with this method here. Given an object, we want to know which index it is for this particular object in the list. If the object does not exist, -1. Okay, the same convention. Finally, if you're given a particular valid index starting from 0, the indices for array list is just the same as array. Okay, and then you'll say get. Okay, that's how you can get a new elements, get the existing element. Okay, it's a very quick walkthrough of the method. Let's do some little bit programming. Okay, so let me show you here. So what I would do is I do have some code over here. Let's do one by one. Okay, before I try to come back here, I will first of all go to Eclipse. Okay, so now I already have a class over here. It's called Arraylist Tester. Okay, so now let's see how we can import array list. Let's do that first. All you got to do is, first of all, you can type array list, and then you can try to use the code completion to help you. If you type control space, it's going to give you options over here. Basically, it's going to tell you array list, which comes from java.util. Okay, if you click on that, at the same time, it's going to add in line number 1 to tell you import, right? So you don't need to type that line for you. It will be there, placed there nicely for you. So now, whenever you want to do an Arraylist declaration, the only thing you have to specify, like in the case of array, you have to give a type of the elements in the array list. Let's say in this case, we want to have an array list of names. Okay? In that case, E over here should just be a string. So what we're doing is we're declaring an array list of string. And then let's give a name of the variable Let's call that list. Okay, so far so good. And then that is assigned to, and then we're saying we're creating new objects over here. And when you create a new object, you want to call the constructor of the array list. So you also say array list. Okay, the easiest way for you to see the syntax over here is you can just repeat this particular declaration over here. It's simply an array list of string. Okay, just like that. And then we're just calling the version of the constructor without any inputs. Okay, like that. Okay, are you comfortable with line number 6 over here? Again, we are declaring a variable called list of type array list, where every element in the array list is of type string. Okay, and then you say that's assigned to a new object over here of array list type. Okay, pretty much like how we did it before, pretty much. Okay. In the exam, you don't have to know how to write code about the collection classes because that's quite an advanced syntax for you to remember. I don't want you to remember. However, you are expected to read the code with collection classes. Okay. But as I give you some optional exercises to do next week, hopefully they'll give you better understanding. Okay, so now let me give you comments here. We are creating an empty list of strings. Okay, simply just empty in the beginning. So now let's do something here right away. So now you can actually call the various methods that's available on the array list. For example, I can say system.out.println. Okay, what do I want to print? I can say size of the list is list cannot be the context objects. Remember, every method that we talk about over here, let me just emphasize that again. You can see every method that we talk about over here, they are non-static. Non-static methods because we don't see any static keywords before them. So that means if you want to call these methods, you have to give a context object, and we do have it. Okay. So now in this case, we simply just do list dot. As soon as you say dot, it's going to give you the list of available methods over here, all the methods. Okay. Let's say the one we want to call right now is the size, S-I-Z-E. Okay, like that. It's a method, so you can see it's empty pair of parentheses over here. Okay, any question here? I think so far the 2 lines we got, we know how to declare a variable of type array list, we know how to create a new one, and also how we can call methods. Basically, the rest of the program, we're going to use the same objects and try to see how we can manipulate this particular list objects. Yes? So list of size is the same as list of length? Good question. I think your confusion is over here. Let me just have a new page for you over here. You're basically asking the following. Okay, let me write it down. So what we just did in Eclipse, we say array list of type string. And then we say list. And that's simply assigned to some new expression, okay, etc. And now what we just did, we simply say list dot size, which is going to return an integer, right? The reason that we are able to do this size over here, simply because there was a size method that's defined over here. That's why we can call that. You're basically asking, what if I write the following? If I say, wow, who's that? List dot length, for example. So now, conceptually, I know what you mean, but the compiler wouldn't know. Because length is actually only belong to array, not for any library class. Okay? So this one here simply will not compile. Okay? Does not compile because length is not part of the API of array list. Because we know that list was declared to be of type array list. Everything you call a list should be belonging to the API of array list. In this case, no. So that's why it wouldn't compile. Does that answer your questions? Okay. Okay, good. Let's do a little bit more. Okay. And now let's go back here. Let's try to do, let's see another one. Let me see the next line to right. Okay, let's try to do something here. At the moment, basically, so we have done these lines so far, okay? We have done this particular line, so this line is done, and this line is also done. What we want to do, the next two, we want to call these two methods, contains and also index of. At the moment, you can think about nothing has been added to the list. The list is simply just empty, right? So what you can think about is, conceptually, list is simply just pointing to something that's empty. So now we're asking the following question. We're calling contains, and we're calling index of. And then we are simply passing some string over here, because we know that every element in the array list should be a string, as we declared. Now we're asking whether or not the string A exists in this particular empty list. No, so that should be false. And also, what should be the index of this non-existing element? -1, right? Because it doesn't exist. Okay, let's see how we can call that. Let's go back to Eclipse over here. System.out.println. Okay, so now, does A exist in the initially empty list? And then I can say list.contains. Okay, if you try to do the code completion, you will see C over there, contains. And then I simply give an element that can be checked inside the list. In this case, I'll just say A. Okay, so now this is going to give me false. Let's try that right away. If I try to execute this block of code, it's going to tell me the size of the list is simply 0. Does A exist in the empty list? False, right? It just returns a Boolean. Oh, one more thing to say. When you try to call methods, I will try to emphasize this more. Let's say over here, contains over here does exist in the API, which is here, contains. And what's the return value for contains? According to the API, it's a Boolean, which can be either true or false. Okay? Now, one more thing to do. Okay, so now if I go back to Eclipse, I want to try another one, index of. So I can say system.out.println. So now index of A in the empty list. Because we know that nothing can exist in the empty list. So all the indices should be just -1. Okay, so now how do we do that? We'll say list the same context objects dot index of and A. Okay, like that. Okay, it's not really too bad. We're just calling methods without knowing exactly how the methods are implemented. So now what should that be? Well, it should be just -1. Okay, you can see -1 over here. Okay, so now what I would do is I will stop here, finish earlier today. Basically, as I said, the plan would be before next Monday, I'll give you some optional exercises on the collection library, array list and hash map. And then we'll continue from there for Monday. Okay? Make sure you show up for Wednesday. I'll talk about the tips for the exam.